I've been shooting with the Canon R5 for a little over a week now. I actually returned it today, sent it back to Lens Rentals because it was just a rental. I think in a lot of the talks I've been doing about the R5, people think that I bought the camera. Didn't buy it, just a rental, so I'm not like on the hook for dealing with some of the problems long term. But it's also not something that I am kind of sad to see it go because it does have some great benefits. So what we're going to be talking about for this stream is kind of a sneak preview of my review for the Canon R5. I'll take you through some of the stuff, some of my testing, some of the data, some of the samples here in kind of a more live environment, and then I'm going to put that together with some of the proper test footage, because no matter what I do, a stream is never going to really capture the true quality. It's going to make its way to YouTube and be compressed anyway, but a live stream is definitely not the best way to evaluate 8K footage or high resolution photos. So I'm going to put all that together into a proper review video, but this will sort of be like a live kind of sneak peek of a lot of my main thoughts on the Canon R5. I'm going to try and do my best to be, I don't know how I say this, mild-mannered, I suppose. I think a lot of the streams I've done before, people have maybe misinterpreted or thought that I've hated the Canon R5. I don't hate it. I'll just get that out of the way right up front. I do not hate this camera. I think it's a fantastic device. It's an amazing piece of technology. It's not perfect, and it does have some serious flaws or issues or just little bugs and nitpicks that I don't particularly care for, but it may or may not make the difference for you. Although I do want to talk about all this stuff because a lot of people seems to be online talk a lot about the specs of some of these new cameras. They praise the cameras. They're great because they basically just read you the spec sheet, and then they might tell you a couple little quirks. Like for the Lumix cameras, it's obviously the autofocus. With maybe the Sony cameras, it's the IBIS, or it's only 12 megapixels with the A7S III. Or with the Canon R5 and the R6, it's the overheating. So we all know the kind of general specs and the general criticism for these cameras. I wanted to share my personal perspective and maybe some of the more in the weeds criticisms that I have for the R5, because there might be minor nitpicks depending on how you look at it, but we can at least go through all that, and hopefully I can share some new interesting stuff that you maybe haven't considered or heard about the R5. Because if you do want to get an R5, they're actually relatively hard to get your hands on them right now. If you don't have one and you need one, for whatever reason that might be, you probably have to rent it because you can't buy them new, and I wouldn't recommend buying them used. But we'll get into all that in a little bit. So hopefully that lays some nice groundwork. I'm going to try and be as even-keeled as possible. I'm not going to go too hard on the R5 because I think when you do that, some people tune out and they don't really listen to what you're saying because they just view you as a hater. But I'm definitely not going to be only praising the camera either, because I think other people tune out and think that you're just a shill or you're a fanboy. I really truly am somewhere in between. I really like the camera for certain reasons, and I really don't like it for others. And hopefully that can kind of give you a sense of where I land. And it's definitely not prescriptive. This is not me saying that my opinion has to be yours or that you have to agree with everything I say. We all shoot different types of content. We all have different needs. So having different tools out in the marketplace is fantastic. And maybe the R5 isn't right for me, but maybe it's right for you. So we're going to talk about all of that and really find hopefully some lessons learned along the way from the R5, and maybe some feedback for Canon and like what they can do to fix it or improve upon it, maybe is a better way to say it, and versus what I think are some of the really good benefits from other camera companies that are doing things a little bit different. And again, we'll get into all this in specifics with some actual data to review, some sample photos and whatnot. And we're going to talk through all of it. It'll be lengthy, but hopefully you can learn something along the way, or just sit back, relax, and listen to my opinion about the Canon R5 and draw your own conclusions from there. So I'll pull it up here in a second. Just going to check the chat, see how everyone's doing. Good morning, good evening. It's night for me. It's good morning for you. In any case, I'm excited to talk about the R5. The Canon R5 is an interesting camera. I'm going to review this from a hybrid perspective. So that being said, we need to talk about the firmware, because that's probably one of the most important things about the R5 is the firmware, because there have been some updates. I was testing all of this with 1.1.0. There is a new 1.1.1 firmware. It seems like Canon is rolling these out relatively quick, so more changes may come in the future. But just so you know, this entire review, everything I'm talking about, the camera body that I rented had version 1.1 on it. So that comes with some of the fixes and updates post initial release that may have been more discussed in a lot of other reviews. First, let's talk about the specs on the Canon R5. This is a little redundant. You probably all know this stuff, so I'm just going to go through it really quick. But of course, it shoots 45 megapixel raw stills at 20 frames per second. Pretty incredible, pretty powerful for photography, and very, very nice. It also shoots 8K RAW, also shoots 10-bit and 8-bit 8K, which I think can get lost in some of the people talking about the specs of this camera. 8K RAW is one of the main premier selling points, but it does 8K 10-bit and 8K 8-bit as well. So you don't have to shoot RAW 8K if you don't want to. You can do some compressed versions of 8K as well. Of course, it does 4K 120, 10-bit, and 8-bit from basically the full sensor readout, which is really impressive. It's got great autofocus, and it's got great IBIS, or so they say. But we're going to talk about all this in more detail. Here's some considerations just right up front, and you can see these photos were taken with the R5. This is just my personal perspective. I really can't stress that enough. This is by no means definitive or saying that you have to agree with me. This is just my personal perspective. I cannot speak for the thousands or millions of shooters out there who are going to use the R5. I can't predict every scenario. I can only talk from what I personally encountered and how the camera applies to me. So just keep that in mind. Everyone is different, and you're going to have different needs. You're going to have different priorities. That's totally fine. Again, this is just my personal perspective because I know my needs, but I have no idea what yours are. So again, just keep all that in mind. I'm really going to try and approach this from a practical standpoint of workflow, acquisition, processing, some of the quirks, just so you can really understand beyond just the specs. We all know the specs. We know what it is on the spreadsheet, on paper, but how does the camera actually function? What is it like to use it? First, let's start with photography because it is a really impressive camera for photography. Again, 45 megapixel stills at 20 frames per second. That's really, really incredible, especially with the electronic shutter, and you can basically just burst mode silently all you want. It's incredible if you really need speed and high resolution out of a camera. The photo ergonomics, handling the R5 works really well for photography. I come from a 5D Mark III, a 5D Mark IV, so you feel right at home using the Canon body. There are some differences in terms of buttons and layout, but it's stuff you get used to pretty quick, and it feels really good to shoot photos with the R5. You also have the incredible RF lens selection. Canon makes some of the best lenses out there, just some really interesting lenses. They're also very expensive in certain cases, but they do work really well. And then they have the legacy EF glass from all their DSLRs that can be adapted very easily to RF. So you can go EF to RF pretty much seamlessly if you want. The adapter works really, really well, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. You do have great autofocus, important for video, but also really important for photography in terms of face tracking, eye tracking, animal detection, people detection. It just works really, really well. I can basically pick up the R5, point it at my subject, and start taking pictures, and I don't have to worry about focus points or checking my focus. It just works. But we also have to talk about what I'm going to call thermal locking. People have talked about overheating. I think that's maybe the wrong word. I'm going to go with thermal locking for now, but basically overheating. This applies to the 4K HQ mode and the 4K 120 mode. I think people also know that it applies to the 8K mode, but more commonly, I think people are going to be using this camera for 4K HQ and 4K 120, and these modes are restricted by this thermal locking. It happens even in standby mode. So this isn't something where only when you're recording it affects you. It happens when you're just in standby. This picture that you see here was taken after the camera was just sitting there, and it was just on. I picked it up and I couldn't shoot anything because it had overheated or been thermal locked just because it was sitting there. And I did have overheat control on, which is one of the new features in the newer firmware. So I'm basically doing the best I can to not have it overheat in standby, and it's still overheated. Like I said, with overheat control on. And there are some workarounds. So solving the problem is really important. When you have any problem, you have to figure out a solution, but it doesn't erase the problem. I think this is where a lot of people will say, you know, oh, you just have to do X, Y, and Z, and then it's not a problem anymore. To me, that's a workaround, and that's fine. It's a good solution, but you still have to acknowledge the problem, which is totally fair. A workaround, the difficulty of the workaround, the ease of the workaround, that all equates in my mind to the severity of the problem. If it's an easy workaround, simple fix, not a big problem. If it's a complicated, dangerous workaround, well, then it's a really, really big problem. Almost every camera has issues that there are workarounds for. So ranking the severity of those problems is always based on the workaround, not necessarily on the problem itself. One of those that I did with the R5 during my time with it was just using the power saving, basically turning the display off after 15 seconds automatically, auto power off after 30 seconds, viewfinder off after a minute. These are all settings you can set easily in the menus to basically have the camera power itself down as frequently as possible. So you don't have to remember to turn it on and turn it off, turn it on and turn it off. The camera can just do it for you very, very quickly and almost irritatingly quick at certain points where it would just go to sleep and then I'd be ready to shoot again and have to kind of wake it back up. It's irritating, it's inconvenient, but I did find it as kind of a nice way to keep the camera cool more or less while I was in between recording sessions. But this isn't going to fix the long continuous recording. It's purely for those little bursts where you're doing a couple clips, then you're moving somewhere else, doing a couple clips, moving somewhere else. It just ensures that the camera is actually off all the time in between because, again, it does overheat in standby. You can also do a date change and a battery pull to fix the thermal locking, which does work, and I encountered this myself. It's a fix. It kind of points more to the timer issue rather than it actually overheating. But if you're curious, all you have to do, if the camera overheats on you, you just change the date to a day in the future, pop out the battery really quick, do a hard battery pull, pop the battery back in, and you have your time back again. It works oddly well. It is relatively simple, but it's really irritating that you have to do it. Autofocus. Let's talk about the autofocus on the R5, specifically in video mode. I'd say it's about 90 to 95% reliable. It's not 100% reliable, but it's close. And I think for a lot of people, they're going to be happy with the autofocus on the R5. Its ability to keep things in focus as you're moving, as the subject is moving, is just really refreshing to have that in a hybrid video camera. It works remarkably well. But it's something you have to consider. Do you want it? Do you need it? I think there's a lot of people who will want it and then find out they actually do need it for certain shots that they're not doing currently via manual focus. There's a lot of things you wouldn't even try because you know they're very, very challenging with manual focus that you may be more inclined to try with autofocus. A lot of people equate autofocus with vloggers or YouTubers trying to keep themselves in focus, which is true and very helpful, but it also applies to people shooting on gimbals or other configurations where the camera isn't easily accessible for using a follow focus or pulling focus manually. So just having good, reliable autofocus in those situations is really nice, and it can open up new styles of shooting for you. I think in a lot of ways, not necessarily the R5 specifically, but just the quality of autofocus in general is a game changer. It's going to give you so many more options when it comes to the type of shot you can get that you may have not been able to do by yourself before, but now you can as a solo shooter, as well as just the type of shots you're willing to try and experiment and play around with. I think it unlocks a lot of creativity that we didn't really have before when we were mostly relying on manual focus. Manual focus isn't going away. It's not going anywhere. It's still fine if that's how you prefer to shoot, but autofocus does unlock quite a few benefits from my perspective. but it can also be a false sense of security. So I wouldn't rely on it 100% of the time. You really have to make sure that what you're shooting is in focus. A lot of the eye detection or face detection will be lighting up on the R5 display, and then upon review in post-production, you might see that it actually popped out of focus for half a second, then pop back in. So the LCD might say, yeah, it's totally in focus the whole time, and then you review the clip later and you realize, oh, it actually wasn't. The tracking works really well, but that doesn't mean it's always going to stay locked exactly where you want it. So you really don't want to trust it 100% and get into that kind of false security thinking it's perfect, it's okay. You really, really have to make sure it is in focus if it is something important. I'll say that the IBIS on the R5 is relatively mediocre from my experience. This could be a combination of, adapters or the type of lenses, and maybe a certain lens isn't supported with the firmware. But I really find that other systems are better. Specifically, the Lumix system just seems to keep things more stable, like the way I would want, rather than what I'm experiencing on the R5. And it doesn't seem as optimized for video as it might be for still photography. At the bottom here, you can see kind of some data points that are taken from basically just me holding the R5 as well as the GH5, just pointed at a still dot on the wall. And then I tracked that data with After Effects to kind of map the plot of the movement of the shot. And you can see the Canon IBIS just regular is a lot more wild. It's erratic. Now, granted, this is zoomed in quite a bit, so this isn't like crazy shake from the IBIS, but it does show you at kind of a microscopic level the effect to which the IBIS is helping, which it's not. You can see the Canon Enhanced, the pink dots there match more closely with the GH5 IBIS and the GH5 IS lock. Both of those modes are kind of meant to just stabilize your footage in general. The locking mode specifically is supposed to basically make it look like a tripod. So you can see how tightly spaced those dots are and just how small that pattern is in the blue and the teal compared to the pink from the Canon Enhanced and the Canon IBIS, just the regular mode. And on the right, you can see when you use IBIS on the R5, it is going to give you a crop. So if you just turn it on, you're already cropping your field of view. And if you go with Enhanced, it's even more severe. So that's something to keep in mind if you're buying the R5, because it's a full frame camera. The moment you rely on the more advanced IBIS and stabilization, the more you're cropping in on that footage and losing those benefits of full frame. Let's talk about the video quality, because I think this is obviously one of the shining points of the R5. You obviously have RAW capabilities with 8K, but you also have 10-bit and you have 8-bit. You also have All-I or IPB. And I really like the way the R5 lays all this stuff out in the menu, where it kind of separates these things into their own little node. A lot of cameras will just combine the whole codec into one little tile, and then you've got, 50 or 100 different tiles to choose from. The R5 separates it all, and so you can kind of pick and choose which style you want. You've obviously got 8K, 4K, or even 1080. And you have this kind of option to go from 4K to 4K HQ, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But it is interesting to distinguish between all the different options that you're presented with in terms of video quality. Of course, you've got 4K 120, which also looks pretty good. We'll talk about that more in a second. Let's talk about 8-bit versus 10-bit. So 10-bit on the R5 is activated when you go into the C-Log profile, that color, the look, the flat log profile. That's how you're going to get 10-bit. So it is really slow to edit and render. I'm working on a somewhat recent MacBook Pro. It's not brand new, but it's not ancient either. And even on Mac, I can't even preview these files in Finder. So it just causes stress on my operating system, on my processor. It's not the easiest and most intuitive thing to edit on your generic, computers that are out there. I'm sure there are newer machines that it works better. I've heard people even having success editing some of this footage on iPads. The newer your machine, the better. But if you have something that's a couple years old, just be aware that 10-bit may cause it to chug. I run into the same problem even with the GH5 and those 10-bit files. My computer just does not like them, so it's something I only use when I am shooting log, because that's when you need the extra bits of information when you're doing heavy color grading. If you're using a baked-in picture profile, neutral, portrait, landscape, one of the kind of default picture profiles, the camera is going to go into 8-bit mode. So you can't actually choose between 10-bit and 8-bit. It's basically on the picture profile, which is kind of an automated way to make sure people shoot the right thing. If you're shooting with a picture profile, you probably don't need 10-bit. If you do, you could argue over that, really. But really 10-bit is meant for log profiles, and 8-bit is perfectly fine for regular picture profiles. And this is smooth playback. Even at 8K and for 4K 120, when I'm shooting 8-bit with the R5, plays back totally fine. So it's not as much of a resolution issue in terms of playback that you might think. It's really just the 10-bit versus 8-bit that causes my machine to chug. Let's talk about 4K HQ versus 4K, and I'm going to call it LQ for low quality. If 4K HQ is high quality, well, let's talk about regular 4K as kind of low quality. 4K HQ is just 4K. This is something that's really, really important, and I think it's kind of smart how Canon did it with the R5 of calling it an HQ mode. Really, this is what just 4K should look like. It's the most detail that can be resolved in a 4K image, and that's what 4K should look like. So anything less than that, I'm going to call 4K, the regular mode, is actually 4K low quality. How many people would enjoy shooting in a mode called 4K low quality? Well, probably not many, but we all want to shoot in this HQ mode because, ooh, high quality, that sounds good. So Canon has strategically, I assume, called the actual, like, just good 4K, what true 4K should look like, they've called that HQ, and then their regular 4K mode, they just call 4K, but really it's lower quality. HQ isn't bigger file sizes. This is really, really important. People think, oh, HQ, it's going to be bigger files, there's more data, yada, yada. No, it's still 3840 by 2160. The pixels are the pixels. It's still 4K. It's just processing better, which is really important to understand. When you're talking about resolution, the container is the resolution, 4K, whatever. But the detail, what's actually resolved in that container, is the true resolution of that clip. Obviously, the HQ mode is restricted. You're going to get that thermal locking or overheating, whatever you want to call it, whereas the lower quality mode, the regular 4K, is unrestricted. You can record continuously and you're not going to run into any overheating problems. Here you can see them side by side. On the left, we've got 4K, middle 4K HQ, and on the right, we have 8K scaled down to 4K. So on the right, that should be the absolute maximum best that 4K can look, and 4K HQ looks really, really close, almost indistinguishable from the 8K scaled down. So 4K HQ is looking really good, but 4K on the left, a little bit softer, and it can be fixed with some sharpening. But this is something we need to talk about in general with Canon video. It's always been kind of soft. 1920 by 1080 is, 2 million pixels, give or take. 3840 by 2160 or 4K is 8.2 million pixels. One pixel is just one color. You can't put more pixels inside of one pixel. The pixel is the pixel. It's one thing. It's either black, it's white, it's gray, it's red, it's blue. But just because you have more resolution going in, if you're scaling it down to 4K or 1080 or whatever it is, the pixel is the pixel and it's only one point of data. So there is a maximum detail limit for 4K, 3840 by 2160. There's 8.2 million pixels that can be something, which can be detail, or it could be absolutely nothing. But you can't get past that limit. You can't have 9 million pixels worth of resolution. You can't have 10 million pixels in 4K. There is that upper limit. But there's no detail minimum. You could have 1 pixel and save it as a 4K file. You could have a smudge or a blurry standard definition video and blow it up to 4K and say it's 4K, but it's still going to be standard def. It's still going to be low detail. So when we look at 4K on the left and 4K HQ and 8K on the right, you can see hopefully a little bit of that shining through. Is it something your average viewer is going to notice? Probably not. And it can be fixed with some sharpening. If we look at the sharpening there, which people say to sharpen the 4K footage and it'll look like the HQ footage, which I think it's fair to then also sharpen the 4K HQ footage and also sharpen the 8K footage to see what that would look like as well. And at this point, they do become very, very hard to distinguish between them. for your casual viewer. If you want to zoom into 100%, zoom into 200%, zoom into 800% in pixel peep, you will notice the details. But for the most part, a lot of people will be completely fine with the regular 4K and then some sharpening in post. However, the 4K HQ does look better and resolves more true detail than the standard 4K mode on the R5. Here's another example of some detail. You can see there with the 4K mode on the left, it's a little softer, not quite as pristine and perfect as 4K HQ or 8K scaled down to 4K. Here we have 4K HQ on the left and 4K 120 on the right to compare, okay, are you taking a resolution hit when you switch to that 120 mode? And to my eye, it looks similar to just the standard 4K mode. You're losing some of that HQ detail, the extra detail that's resolved in that, kind of oversampled mode. But in general, it's perfectly fine and acceptable to do the 4K 120 and then sharpen in post. Most people aren't going to notice the difference if you're finalizing in 4K. It's really only those pixel peepers or the absolute image purists who are maybe even going to spot the difference. But by the time it gets uploaded and compressed to the web, all that's probably gone anyway. I also wanted to compare it to 1080p 120 from the GH5. So up top, you can see 4K HQ. In the middle, you can see 4K 120, and then at the bottom, 1080 120. 1080 120 does look worse, but is it significantly worse? To your average viewer, probably not. So if you're considering the R5 because you think you need 4K 120, it's nice, it's great to have, but it is a restricted mode. It's going to have that thermal lockdown on you. And if you have something that shoots 1080p 120 like the GH5, don't expect you're going to have this radical upgrade for 4K 120. It is better, but by how much? Because this is 1080p scaled up to 4K. And at that resolution, some people may spot the difference, but many won't. I need to talk a little bit about the ND adapter. So I'm converting a lot of my EF lenses to the RF mount, and I'm doing that because I get the benefit of a built-in ND filter in the EF to RF mount. Canon has a version of the EF to RF that has ND in it, which is fantastic. Still get smooth autofocus. So even using EF lenses, I'm still getting the face tracking, the eye detection, the quick autofocus, which is incredible that Canon has been able to do this of converting their EF glass to RF. You'd almost think it should come with more of a hit in terms of performance, but it doesn't. It works remarkably well. It's very, very convenient to have a built-in ND filter. This is what I talk about all the time, especially if you're shooting outdoors. You have aperture, ISO, and shutter speed to control your exposure, but for video, your shutter speed should be relatively locked based on your frame rate. And your ISO is only going to go down so low, and you probably want a shallow depth of field, so you're going to be filming with a relatively wide aperture, maybe 2.8, f4, f5.6. So really, when you're outdoors, the only way to control the excessive amount of light is with ND filters. If they're in front of the lens, that you have to deal with different size filters, different lenses, changing them all the time. When it's built right into the adapter, it's just really convenient and works really well. However, there is this maximum color shift on the right. You can see at maximum, the image turns blue, aggressively so, where my white balance is set for daytime. You can even see in the top picture there where I'm at the high setting on the ND filter in the adapter. It looks great, it looks fine, but the moment you go to maximum ND on that Canon adapter, it just shifts the whole picture blue, which I find really annoying that they didn't stop. It does have hard stops on both ends on the minimum and the max. I wish they had stopped the max a little bit earlier to avoid that color contamination, because it is really irritating to push your ND to max and then always have to throttle it back a little bit to avoid that color shift. We should also talk about white balance in regards to all this. It's record locked, and this is really, really irritating. The moment you hit record on the R5, you cannot change your white balance. You can even assign it to the RF control ring. If you have an RF lens like the 24-70, it has an extra control ring on that lens that you can assign to set white balance, which works great when you're not recording. You can spin that wheel, change your white balance on the fly, but the moment you hit record, you cannot change your white balance anymore. This makes sense for photography. When you take a picture and your white balance is your white balance, you change your white balance, take another photo. But when you're recording and things are changing on the fly, you're moving from room to room, from space to space, not being able to change your white balance is really, really irritating because it means you have to stop recording, change your white balance, and then hit record again, making an entirely separate clip, which is fine if that's your workflow. But if you want long clips for continuous recording, you can't change your white balance on the fly. And I find that really irritating, especially because many other cameras allow you to change white balance on the fly, and the R5 just doesn't let you do it. I find it really irritating. Also, another irritation on the R5 is the video display. So I would say it's missing information. And you can see on the top photo, that's before recording, but the bottom photo is during recording. And you can see how much information just disappears the moment you hit record. A lot of this information I find really valuable even during recording. So the time remaining isn't displayed. You have the maximum time you can record up there on the top. It says 25 minutes. So I can record for 25 minutes, and then once I start recording, I'm recording for 9 seconds, but it doesn't tell me how much space I have left on the card. Can I keep recording for 30 minutes? Do I need to change cards in an hour? How much more time can I keep recording? It's kind of irritating not to know at a glance of when you're going to need to change cards. Also, the histogram disappears the moment you hit record. And this is not a situation where you can hit the info button or hit the display button to change your settings and get all this stuff back. The moment you hit record, all this stuff is gone. And the only way to get it back is to stop recording. So your histogram just disappears during recording. This may be fine for some people, but for me, I like seeing that my exposure is the exposure because the sun may come into play. It may change things a little bit. And if you have zebras on, that's a good way to control for it. But having a live histogram during recording seems really valuable to me. It also doesn't show you the codec. The moment you hit record and you go, oh, was I in 8K or was I in 4K? Like what mode am I in? It doesn't display, it's gone. So there's no good way to know other than stopping recording to check what codec you're in. Also really irritating because you might be in the right one and you just want to double check and know for sure that you're capturing 8K when you intend to be shooting 8K. Nope, you have to stop recording to check. It also doesn't tell you the AF type. So if I'm in, face detection mode, it doesn't tell me when I'm recording anywhere. It basically clears out the whole display for the sake of keeping a cleaner feed, but I don't have the option to turn on all that other valuable information that was there before that's now missing. The exposure meter, you see at the bottom before, you can see if you're over or under with stops, that disappears during recording. You can't bring it back. You also don't know what picture profile you're in. So if you're shooting C-Log, you do have a monitoring option to display kind of with a LUT, so you can see that flat profile a little bit clearer on the display. But the moment you hit record, you don't know what picture profile you're in. So you have to dig through the menus, you have to stop recording, go see, okay, am I in neutral? Am I in C-Log? Like, what am I shooting? Am I in the right mode? Am I shooting 8-bit? Am I shooting 10-bit? You don't know when you're recording. The Q menu, the quick menu, also just turns to nothing the moment you're recording. You basically have headphone volume, and that is it. When you're recording, it's all gone, just headphone volume. Compare that to the Lumix cameras, which show you the picture profile. They show you the codec. They show you the autofocus mode. They show you the time remaining. They show you audio meters. Now, the R5 does show you audio meters if you're in manual mode, but it doesn't show you audio meters when you're in auto mode. So just because I'm in auto, I don't want to see the meters. Why wouldn't I want that? The R5 will show them in manual mode, but not if you're in auto mode. It shows you a histogram on the Lumix cameras. It shows you which card you're recording to during recording. It shows your exposure meter. It shows you that you're shooting log with a LUT if you have that activated. And the great thing about these cameras is if this is too cluttered, if this is too much junk on screen, you just hit the display button and you get that clean feed. You can cycle through the different views. So you can see the mode where it shows you everything, and then you can hit display and then it's all gone and you have that clean feed so you can compose your shot and check your exposure just by eye. So you really have control over what you're seeing during recording, whereas on the R5, I always felt limited. I felt like I had to stop recording just to check to make sure my settings were accurate and then start recording again. Really, really inconvenient. Compare the two menus. On the left, you have the Lumix GH5. On the right, you have the Canon R5. And you can see just how much more is there on the GH5 during recording compared to the R5, which basically strips all that information away. You have access to none of it. And I think that can be just really, really inconvenient as you're filming. We should also talk about buying these cameras used or new. Right now, they are very hard to find. If you want to buy the R5, good luck. They're not getting shipments. Everywhere sold out. The people who have them are enjoying them. Everyone else is sitting there waiting in limbo. You also see inflated prices, upwards of $5,000, $6,000 in some cases for these cameras on eBay. It's insane considering the retail value of them is $4,000. So the prices right now, because they are in short supply, are really, really high, way higher than they ought to be. And so if you want to buy an R5 new, you're gonna have to spend a lot of money to get one. I'd also recommend avoiding any used cameras. I think used is a little risky, especially in the R5 case when these cameras are being tested by who knows how many people. They're putting them in freezers, they're putting them in fridges, they're taking the cases apart to see what's overheating, what's not. You don't know what the person before you did to the camera, and specifically with the R5, because there's been so much experimentation and tinkering, I'd be really hesitant to buy an R5 used because that person could have done some serious damage to it that you don't know about. Overall, I would say the R5 is an 8 out of 10. Maybe I've been going kind of hard on it in this second half, but I really wanted to point out my minor nitpicks and gripes. Overall, I do think it's a really impressive camera, definitely for photography, but also for video as well. You've got excellent quality. Both photo and video looks great. It's fantastic. And you get 4K 120, you get 8K if you want. It's really impressive. But there's some really annoying restrictions. Not just the thermal locking, but also just in the functionality and using the camera. Not being able to use it to its fullest all the time is very frustrating. And these unnecessary limitations, I'm kind of just done with it. I think Canon has always kind of done this to their DSLR or hybrid cameras, and it feels so unnecessary, especially with these kind of timer resets that people are implementing now with the overheating issues that are happening. You can just reset it with the date change and a battery pull. So really, it is just a timer. It has nothing to do with temperature. And some of the restrictions when you're recording video, just what's being displayed. Why can't the camera show me all the settings on the fly? Why can't I change my white balance on the fly? It's maybe a little bit of a nitpick, a little bit of a gripe, but I do think it's important to point out because there's many other cameras that feel far more intuitive when you're shooting video. Overall, I would say the R5 feels like a photography camera that has a video mode, but it doesn't feel like a true hybrid camera. I think I'm kind of back where I started in a lot of ways with the R5. I came in really disappointed that it even had the overheating thermal lockdown issues on the R5 and on the R6. And hearing that from the reviews was just really disappointing because I wanted to love the R5, but I ended up not feeling so great about it. So I went into this very skeptical. And upon initial shooting with the R5, I felt pretty good, especially taking photos. It felt very comfortable, felt very intuitive. I come from Canon shooting, so it feels right to take photos with these cameras. And I started to really enjoy the autofocus and the menus, and just using the camera felt really good. And I started to be kind of delighted by it. But then I encountered the thermal locking, which is frustrating. And it made me change the way I shoot in terms of thinking more about the limits placed upon me by the camera rather than just, hey, this would be a cool creative shot. I'm going to get it at 4K 120, or I'm going to switch to 8K for this particular shot because I need the resolution, or, oh, I'm going to go do 4K HQ for this because I want it to really look its best. Instead, I'm calculating in the back of my mind, oh, well, I can't use those modes, or I don't want to overheat the camera. I got to make sure I'm turning it off. I got to make sure I'm not using it too much. And now you're just doing this balancing act of trying to keep the camera happy so that you can actually use it the way you want. And you feel subservient to the camera rather than the camera serving you as a tool in your toolkit. And so my enthusiasm dove a little bit. But then I would review the footage and really be happy with the resolution that's there and the color and the autofocus. The IBIS leaves something to be desired. It's not the best, but it's fine, whatever. It's there, I guess. So overall, it's kind of mixed. It is a great camera. I would say it's an 8 out of 10, but I also wouldn't say it's something you have to have or you should go buy right now, especially considering the prices. Who knows if they'll actually unlock the overheating issues. I doubt it at this point. They've just done kind of better temperature management, but even then it's still annoying and clearly just a timer at some level in the camera. I'm curious if there's going to be damage to these cameras long term for the people who are using and abusing them and recording 8K constantly, pushing it to its limit. Is it too hot? I don't know. And I think that's also really frustrating that we even have to think about these things or consider them when the camera should just kind of work the way it ought to work. It's a very expensive camera, and to put that much money into a tool, you really expect it to work to its fullest potential. And right now, the R5 seems limited in that regard. I haven't shot with the R6 yet. Maybe I'll get my hands on it at some point, but the way Canon treats the video mode in general just doesn't feel like the right camera for me at this point in time. I'd prefer something that felt more intuitive, that just gave me the information I needed rather than having to constantly be stopped, be interrupted, dive through menus to access what I want regularly. These are normal features that are part of shooting video that I rely on constantly. And for them not to be there at my fingertips and be kind of hidden or kind of buried or unable to access is also just a minor irritation that just builds up over time, where it is just really frustrating. Shooting photos works great. Everything's right there, everything you would want. For video, not so much. And that's why I really think that Canon has designed a photography camera with a video mode, but they haven't spent the time to make a true hybrid, which if they had, they could have had one of the best cameras of all time. Instead, they ended up missing the mark, and maybe missing it more than they initially expected. I think the R5 will rub a lot of people the wrong way, and I'm sure there's people who will hate it far more than me. They'll give it like a 1 out of 10, and then I'm sure there's other people who will give it 10 out of 10. For me, it's right at that, B level. It's not an A plus camera. It's maybe like a B minus. It's right in that range of just low 80s. It feels really good for what it does, but you wish that it did more of that better in other modes and just felt as good as a video camera as it does as a photo cam, because it's very close. It's not far off the mark. I'm not asking for XLR inputs or SDI, or anything crazy like that. It's just giving people access to what's already there, what's already built in the camera. Just open it up. Unlock the thermal management nonsense. Cut that out. Give people the opportunity to use this camera to its fullest, and I think you'll have very happy customers. But right now, that's clearly not the case. How's everybody doing? So hopefully that gives you some insight into what I'm thinking about the R5 right now. It's everything I said. It's 8 out of 10. I don't know what to tell you. I'm not going to buy one, but if you buy one, that's fine. It'll do a great job. It'll take excellent photos. It'll shoot excellent video, but it's just not the right tool for me. An R5 Mark II re-engineered to make room for a thin copper or water vapor heat pipe on processor would be pretty great for anyone who likes the current feature set. R5 with autofocus on a really close-up on interview's face and a static wide would be perfect for an interview shoot. An unlikely autofocus miss won't matter if there's a backup camera, also adds variation. Yes, I'm curious, is the 4K on the 6K better than the 4K low on the R5? Everything I've heard is that the R6 does do better 4K than the R5. However, that mode on the R6 does overheat, as they say. So you reach a limit on the R6 where that overheats in 4K and you have to drop it down to 1080. So I can't speak to that personally from my own experience. I would say that the R5, the low 4K mode with sharpening, is fine for most people. I think it's disappointing that you can't actually use just 4K HQ, which really is just regular 4K. Like that is true 4K. That's what 4K should look like, is the 4K HQ mode. So the fact that they kind of locked that behind this wall and then you have to rely on this kind of low quality mode is irritating. That's a lot I keep saying that about this camera, but it's just overall it's just irritating. It's like, why does it have to be this way? Why couldn't you make this just a little bit better? It's a $4,000 camera. You couldn't just do a little bit of tweaking here or there to make it better, but no, it is what it is, and it's kind of frustrating. The R6 ought to be much better than the R5 4K low. Not throwing away a lot of the sensor must be a huge advantage to detail and ISO, I imagine. Yeah, and like the low quality mode 4K on the R5, it's soft, but it's like that typical Canon soft. If you shot 1080p on a 5D Mark III, if you're a Canon shooter, you shot 1080p on a 5D Mark III, it's not 1080p. Okay, it's super soft. It's not, there's not detail there. You can shoot 1080p on like a GH4 or GH5, like it'll look way better, far more detail. And so Canon has always had those kind of poor quality video modes. So the 4K regular is just kind of standard in my mind for like what Canon normally delivers. So maybe that's why I'm a little bit more forgiving. It's like, it's to be expected. I wish it was all 4K HQ and you could just record continuously that way, but you can't, and it'll overheat on you. So you're limited to that like more regular mode. But if you've been shooting Canon, especially Canon 1080p, you know, from like the 5D Mark III or, you know, similar cameras, like their 60D, the 70D, 80D, the 7D, like all that, the 1080p on the Canon cameras is always not the best. So the 4K mode is just like more of the same. The GH5 with just pushing display button to quickly change how much junk you want on the screen while recording is so much more convenient. You said it before I finished typing. Yeah, the R5 basically gives you two feeds. Like when you're recording, you have like your info on screen and then like a clean feed. The GH5 gives you a few that you can cycle through. I think the R5 also has like a blackout mode and then like a full display where it doesn't show you the picture. It just shows you all the details. But there's no true mode on the R5 that shows you all the stuff you have before recording during recording. I think they could probably easily implement that with firmware. It would just be like offering that like as an update, and they should, which is why I call it out, right? Like I haven't heard anyone mention it, of like the irritations of filming video without having access to all the stuff that's important when you're shooting video. So I thought I'd at least call it out and mention it because no one else really is. And for me, it seems like they're kind of giving Canon a pass for stuff that should just be there. Like you hit record, like why does it all go away? Like let me turn it off by hitting info, just like I do on the GH5. I hit display, it goes away, hit display, it comes back. That's what I want, not like, oh, you hit record, all of it's gone. Well, I needed that histogram, or I wanted that exposure meter, or what resolution was I recording? Oh shoot, let me stop recording, check, make sure, okay, yes, I am in 8K mode, okay, good, hit record again. That kind of stuff is just, it slows you down in a way that is imperceptible, because most people say, well, that's not that big of a deal. But when you add all those up throughout a day, shoot after shoot after shoot, and just the minor irritations that you're constantly battling with, like fighting with this camera, of like not having what you want right there. Like I noticed that you couldn't change the white balance during recording, and then I immediately, like a day later, had a situation where I was recording something and I was like, I wish I could change the white balance right now during recording, and I can't. I have to stop, change the white balance, start again. And it's just there's a little frustrations just really add up. It still overheats on the latest firmware, just less of a problem. Why the early implementation was so super crappy. The timer hack is debatable. Yeah, it still overheats. No, I had the camera just sitting there and it overheated in standby. So if you think you're gonna get the R5 and you're never gonna experience any overheating issues, if you use the power saving settings, you will definitely avoid them, but you'll probably still encounter them. For me personally, the rental unit I had, so I posted this, the rental unit that I got, the on-off switch was broken. So the camera was just always on. So I couldn't even turn it off if I wanted to. The switch just didn't work. So I was forced to basically use those power saving settings to keep myself, safe and keep my sanity, so that the camera would just turn itself off and I wasn't just wasting battery and having it overheat unnecessarily. Pre-launch, I was considering entering the Canon RF system, then everything was so disappointing. I'm impressed you considered it 8 out of 10. I imagine I'd dislike it much more. It's really going to depend on the person. For me, the issues that I encountered are not the deal breakers. Like for me personally, I can work with the overheating. Like I encountered the situation where I was shooting 8K and it overheated, and I was like, all right, change the date, pop the battery, put it back in. All right, back to it. And You can shoot 8K, like that is impressive. You can shoot 4K 120, that is impressive. The autofocus works really well, that's impressive. The fact that they put these 10-bit modes in there for C-Log is great. Like the photography, 45 megapixels, it's a lot. I'll say 45 megapixels, you think you might want 45 megapixels, and then you run it through your computer and you realize like how annoying that is to process. Even JPEGs that large can just bog down your machine. So thankfully you can shoot in like lower, you can shoot medium or you can shoot small JPEGs and then still keep the RAWs if you want. In any case, it's a very well-spec'd camera. I can't really rate it lower than an 8 out of 10 because like the hardware and the power that's there is really impressive, but it definitely loses those 2 points for just putting all that kind of behind. It's not a paywall per se, but like that's what it feels like. It feels like an app, that has like microtransactions, or like it's a fun game, and then you hit that paywall where it's like, oh, if you want to keep playing, if you want to unlock the timer, if you want to do this, then you have to pay. And you're like, but this is really fun. And like in that situation, like it's a free game usually, so you're like, okay, I'll pay to do whatever if you really like the game. Otherwise, you just go find another one. In this case, you paid for the camera. You paid $4,000 or maybe even more if you bought it now off of eBay, $5,000, $6,000. To have those issues and something you paid so much for feels really awful. And the people who get them and the people who buy them, I'm sure they will love them. So I can't say it's 4 out of 10, it's awful, it's terrible, because the people who buy it, they're gonna love it. If you're willing to, if you like Canon, if you like RF glass, if you like 45 megapixels at 20 frames per second, like you'll love it. But it's not, it could have been a 10 out of 10. It could have been perfect camera if it had just a few extra things that just kind of smoothed it out and made it just all that much more well-rounded for people who also like to shoot video. I don't know if Canon, like people say it's to protect the cinema line. I just don't, maybe they think it's not worth it to put it in these bodies, but I think they'd sell far more if keep all the photo features, but just like polish up the video side of things and don't make it feel so restrictive. I wish the R5 had a dedicated video switch like the 5D series had. Yeah, switching between the photo and video modes on the R5, by default, you have to hit the mode button on top, hit info on the back, and then you jog into video mode, and then to get back to photo, you hit mode, hit info. So it's like 2 button presses, which can be really irritating. However, I think you can program that to a custom button. So there's like the M function button on the front, kind of near the shutter release. I think you can switch that to changing between photo and video modes, so you can do some custom programming with buttons, but just by default, not having a switch. I never really liked the way the Canon cameras did it with that toggle where you'd flip to video mode or flip back to photo mode. I, for whatever reason, gravitate more towards the click wheel on top of the camera, but that's just a personal preference. I think in general, it would just be nice to have a clear button or a switch, a lever, something on the R5 to designate, okay, now you're in photo mode. All right, now you're in video mode. Because the way it is now, it's not always super clear when you boot up the camera, and then you realize, oh shoot, I'm in photo mode, I need to switch to video, or oh, I'm in video, I need to switch to photo. And then you have to hit the mode, hit the info. Again, you can change that with custom programming, but I just like cameras that work a little bit better and more intuitively, like right out of the box, rather than it being like, oh, well, I can use this custom button for this, for this function. I was going to use it for this other function, but I guess I have to assign it to this other one because it's more important. So just having, base functionality, switching between photo and video is something that people are going to be doing very frequently on the R5. So it seems like something that should have a dedicated mechanism toward, rather than being a two arbitrary button presses. Just like hitting mode and then hitting info. Like, why is that what they went with to program? Like, it just feels really strange. The R5 is probably just line skipping. The 5D Mark II didn't even collect 1080p lines in its video buffer. It rendered video from too few pixels. Yeah, right. Yeah, the 4K, maybe that's an extreme to compare them, but the R5, I guess I would just say that is like, if people have been fine, and I know many people are totally fine, and they were, 5 years ago, they were totally fine with Canon 1080p video. They thought it was great, they thought it was beautiful, it was perfect, it's all they ever wanted. And now, we're talking about 4K and 4K HQ or 8K. Anyone who is fine with Canon 1080p video on their DSLRs will be completely fine with the regular 4K mode. It's maybe some of the other people who have shot with, cameras that resolve more detail and deliver a better, version of 4K. I get this all the time, and I don't know the right way to describe this to somebody, but people think that, because I would always explain it this way: if the Canon 1080p, the 5D Mark III, let's say, shoots 1080p, it says it's 1080p, but there's detail that's lacking there. And to prove that, I'm going to shoot 4K on the GH4, and I'll scale it down to 1080, and I'll show you what true 1080p should look like. Because you have a high resolution source, you scale it down, and you're fitting the maximum detail in that 1080p container possible. People will say, oh, well, that's because you're starting with 4K, so it's going to be better. It's like, no. I'm still delivering a 1080p file. If you export this, it's 1920 by 1080. I promise you, it's 2 million pixels. That's all the detail that's there. I'm starting with a high resolution source to show how much detail you can actually fit in 1080p. And they say, well, that's not fair. That's you're cheating. That's more resolution. And it's like, but it's not. I'm literally scaling it down to 1080p. It is only 2 million pixels. Like, there's not more detail somehow in there, because you could start with a 100 megapixel photo. If you scale it down to 1080, like, it's 1080. Like, there's not secretly more detail in that final image you export when it's 1920 by 1080. You can't have, 4 pixels inside of 1 pixel. The pixel is the pixel. So hopefully I described that properly, because like, the people will just read the box and say, oh, the 5D Mark III shoots 1080p, it's 1080p, or oh, the R5 shoots 4K, it's 4K, and then oh, there's this 4K HQ mode. It's like, no, 4K HQ mode is just 4K. That's what 4K should look like. It's not a bigger file size. Like, there's not magically, somehow they're fitting more detail into that 4K. Like, it's just a better processor version of what 4K should truly look like. The regular 4K mode is, that's the one that has the limitation. That's the one that's not good. It's low quality. The 4K HQ isn't high quality. It just is 4K. So it's the marketing and the way these cameras are labeled and how they're hyped is so misleading to so many people. And it's really hard to have those conversations, because people somehow think that 4K HQ is like better 4K. And it's like, no, that's just 4K. The 4K mode is not 4K. They're lying to you. And that's a really hard conversation to have, because people don't want to hear it. But I promise you, if you take a big 8K, 12K, whatever, you scale it down to 4K, like, that's 4K, and it's like the best that 4K can look. If anything looks worse than that, like, the camera's lying to you, and it's not true 4K that it's shooting. What's your thoughts of the Sony a7S III? Well, the Sony a7S III is probably the next camera I have lined up to rent, to try out, because my only reservation on the a7S III is the menus and the navigation, the functional use of the camera. Not a huge fan of the Sony menus and just how their cameras have operated in the past. I think their camcorders or cinema cameras are always clunky and have terrible menus. I think their hybrids always have terrible menus, and I do not like them. And so now that they've redesigned it on the a7S III, I'm eagerly optimistic to try it out and see if it works better, if it feels better, if stuff is displayed properly while I'm filming, and the fact that I can do 4K 120 with good autofocus. I hear the Sony IBIS isn't the best. It's probably the worst one of like Lumix, Canon, and Sony. Like, Sony seems to not have great IBIS, but again, I have to try it. I'll say the R5 IBIS, really not all that impressed. The issues I was having were like, I'd just be hand-holding and feel like, okay, with a GH5, I know this would be stable. But with the R5, it's like, it's really shaky, doesn't feel quite right, and not feel quite right, but like, it doesn't look right when I'm in editing. I go, this is really shaky. Like, I had this stabilization on. Like, why does it look this way? I'm just holding still. Meanwhile, you can do that on the GH5, no problem. It's fantastic. So having such weak IBIS in the R5 was disappointing. And if it's even worse on the Sony, maybe that's the deal breaker. I don't know. I have to just test it out and know for sure. I've seen quite a few of the reviews, people talking about it online, and it looks great. I think there's a lot of people who are going to get the a7S III and be very, very happy. But I think oddly enough, I'm gravitating more towards the Lumix S5. I mean, I talked about it upon the kind of press announcement, and even before that, talking about some of the rumors and the specs. But I'm really warming up to the S5 and the idea of working around those limitations that it does have. Right, autofocus isn't perfect, and the 4K 60 mode is cropped. But when I reviewed the S1H, or at least I didn't do a formal review, but I at least talked about it extensively. The S1H is awesome. And my only note at the time was really, this would be great. They should do a price cut, make the S1H cheaper. And they sort of did that with the S5. I would equate it more to like a full frame GH5 than like a mini version of the S1H. But it really, they dabble. They're basically the same. Do you want it? Is it an S1H? Is it a smaller, cheaper S1H with less features, or is it a more powerful GH5? And I think that's a really nice place to be, especially for only $2,000. The more I think about it, I go, wow, that's a lot of value. $2,000 gets you an S5, which is basically the price cut I was asking for the S1H. Granted, it's not all of the features. It'd be really nice if the S5 could do 6K, but it can't, or if it didn't crop in 4K 60. That'd be really nice if there wasn't a crop there. But for the most part, you get vlog, you get the stabilization. Maybe it's not as good. We'll see. You get improved autofocus, supposedly. Again, we'll see. But for $2,000, having a kind of souped up GH5, because I didn't get the GH5S. I know there's a lot of people that like the GH5S, but for me, without the stabilization, it just felt too limiting. And you're taking that megapixel hit when you're shooting photos. The S5 fixes both of those things. You have higher megapixel photos, so you have 24 megapixels, and you have IBIS, but you still get dual ISO, you get full frame, you get vlog, you get all that great stuff. So for $2,000, considering the GH5S was $2,500, I think when it first came out, it was like $2,500. It was really expensive. Felt oddly expensive for what you got, which is why I skipped that. But then I go, oh, the S5, $2,000, and you get a free lens with it if you do the pre-order thing right now. I go, wow, that's actually oddly impressive, considering the only other option right now would be an A7S III, which does work if you need the autofocus and you want that. But that's, $1,500 more. That's a steep price to pay. And especially if you're going from, like me, I love the GH5. Okay, wonderful camera. I hardly ever complain about it because I think it's awesome. It's probably one of my most favorite cameras to use, even having an Ursa Mini Pro. The Ursa Mini Pro is great. It's fantastic, best looking footage, but it's not as fun to shoot with because it's big, it's bulky. Even though it's mini, it's still big and bulky. The GH5 is just that camera you can take with you anywhere, shoot anything, and it's always going to get the job done. Maybe it's not the best in low light. Maybe the autofocus doesn't work all that well in video mode, but still, with those few limitations, there's some workarounds for that. And most of the time, that stuff doesn't apply to my shoots anyway. So seeing the S5, I go, yeah, maybe I really should consider this, because I am warming up to it in a way that my initial thoughts were kind of like, it doesn't really do enough, doesn't change the game enough. But then I go, wow, for that price, maybe it is worth it to switch from the GH5. I'm still probably most excited about a GH6, whatever that might be, or whatever Blackmagic has lined up for their pocket cinema cameras, whatever the next one of those is. That's probably what I'm most excited for. But because we don't really know when that stuff's coming, it's kind of like figuring out, okay, what makes the most sense right now? Is it the A7S III? Is it the S5? It's probably not the R5. It's not the R6. So what else is out there? What makes the most sense right now? And I think right now it's the S5 and the A7S III. At least, for me, that's what makes the most sense. Wonder if the rental unit had been torn down or if the button is easily broken by rough handling. My guess is that someone took the camera apart and then messed up that switch. It's just a switch, a lever mechanism, so I could imagine it could be easily broken, especially if you're taking the camera apart. And that's why I would caution anyone from buying an R5 or an R6 used, because I imagine the ones that are out there or that will be out there eventually are cameras that have been in freezers, are cameras that have been taken apart, are cameras that have been used and abused in ways that I've never put my GH5 in the freezer. I've never had a reason to. Why would I put it in the freezer? So you just wonder, condensation, right? If you put a camera in the freezer and you pull it out, like it's going to get condensation. Is it in that inside? Is that getting the electrical circuits, wet? Is that going to corrode them over time? Is it going to rust? Like what's going to, like, you don't know some of that stuff internally that's going on. And you could easily buy something that becomes, faulty in 6 months or something like that, because it's been through too much from people testing it and thinking like, oh, well, I imagine there's a lot of people out there who got an R5, have been testing it to figure out what the overheating situation is, and then they're looking at the sale prices on eBay for these things being $5,000, $6,000 and going, hey, I can sell this and make money? Great, put it out there, and people will buy it, and they're going to get an awful product, and then these people are going to be making money on their initial purchase of this camera that's just so controversial. It's kind of interesting the way this is all unfolded and why I still like talking about it. The A7S III cropped IBIS variant seems crazy good for vloggers. People just walk around and get pretty great image, but no true 4K then, of course. Oh, you just mean, yeah, no true, like, oh, yeah, because it's 12 megapixels. Yeah, we'll see. If I get my hands on it, I'll test it out. I don't like to make... It is, I mean, it's really weird, the situation we're in, where the people talking about the cameras are typically vlogging, more or less. That's what I'm doing, right? But I like to approach it from like, okay, is this a professional, like a tool for a professional job, which vlogging and YouTubing certainly is for many people. That's what they do full time. But I think it's a very narrow lens to focus through, and something I think even camera manufacturers are getting too focused in on, of like, oh, it's a vlogger camera. It's for vloggers. It's for vlogging. Like, get the was it the G100? It's for vlogging. Oh, this is a great vlogging camera. It's got the flip screen for vlogging. It's fantastic. It's got autofocus for vlogging. All these features, like vlogging, sure, if you think of like someone just holding a camera pointing at themselves selfie style, but like, what about just the people who just are just content creators? The people who, yes, they're making content for YouTube, but maybe they're not a vlogger, or they want to just make a music video, or they want to make a short film, or they want to put something on their YouTube channel that's not a vlog necessarily. I just think it's a very narrow lens to view all this stuff through, and a weird way to market, because most people who are vloggers don't even call themselves vloggers. They call themselves filmmakers, or, cinematographers, or whatever, even though they might be making a vlog to talk about a camera that they're going to then use for a proper professional job. So it's a really weird, nuanced, gray area right now of who does this apply to? And the people who are talking about the camera as using it for a professional job are doing it while vlogging many times. So it's just weird. I don't like to look at the R5 of oh, is this a good vlog camera? I think that should kind of reveal itself by creating the content and talking about it, and how when you see the review, when I finally put it all together, you'll get that impression of okay, this camera could be used for a vlog, because that's clearly kind of what you're looking at. But I don't want to review something purely from will this be a good vlogging camera? Because I think that's too narrow and too limited. I think give people cameras and just let them create whatever they want to create with it, whether it's a vlog, a music video, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Give them good tools and they'll use them. Like autofocus, it's not inherently only for vlogging. Even the flip screen, people say, oh, it doesn't need a flip screen unless you're a vlogger. I have this camera, the GH5, it's basically up against a wall. Granted, I am vlogging, I suppose, but there's plenty of times where I put a GH5 in an oven or in a place where I can't easily access the back of it, but I need to flip it forward. I'm not vlogging, but I'm putting the camera in some place or putting it in a corner where I don't have, I need the screen to flip around towards me, or to the side. So there's a lot of those features that are just helpful tools regardless, and we shouldn't get too, pigeonholed into just oh, it's good for vlogging. Because yeah, okay, great. That's fine, but what else can it do? Let's see, I saw some footage from the A7S III using its gyro data in post to stabilize, and it was near gimbal-like, only real issue is crank the shutter speed up for fast-moving shots. Yeah, so I saw that video as well, which is basically a deal breaker for me. I don't want to have to crank my shutter speed up, which is the way that works, right? It needs as little motion blur as possible to stabilize, but I don't want to have to shoot that way. I'd rather, do it right in camera, because I don't want to have to rely on some post-production process to make it look good. The quickest path to good content, I think, is almost always the best way to do it. So if the camera can stabilize for you and do it really well, like that's what I'm going to use. It's nice in a pinch if you have some, warp stabilizer or something that helps fix it, but then that's going to add to your render time. And it maybe can present its own issues and errors as well, and it's never perfect either. So I like to use those tools as like supplements, but not as, my core. I'm relying on it. I like a camera, like I bought the GH5 because it had, IBIS and pretty good IBIS, and then the GH5S didn't have it. Felt like, oh, well, yeah, no thanks. I don't want that, because a lot of these cameras you are shooting handheld a lot of the time, and you don't always have time to set up a gimbal. So the better the camera can stabilize it, I think kind of the more useful it is. That, and you do have to crop in a bit, not a big deal with wider lenses though. June says, thanks for the review. I'm now using EOS R. I might skip the new R5 and R6 and just add Atomos Ninja 5 to use 1080p 10-bit on the EOS R. I'm cool with Canon 1080p. Well, great. Everyone's different. Everyone has different needs. I personally like to shoot 4K for pretty much everything. But if 1080p is good enough for your projects, then that's good enough. It's not wrong. I think I'll just stick to Micro Four Thirds full frame, heavy and expensive, and for my multicam can get so many Blackmagic pocket cinema cameras and cheapo cinema lenses for the cost of going to an A7S III, R5, S5 plus 3 basic lenses. Yeah, if you're doing multicam stuff, that's definitely a consideration. If you need more than one camera, the cost of that camera and the lenses adds up. Is it exponentially? It adds up quickly. So if you just need the one camera, $2,000, maybe it's not that big of a deal. But if you factor in the lenses and you're going to buy multiple of these, that can eat up cost pretty quick. For me, if I buy the S5, it'll just be, kind of one and done. Maybe I'll get another one eventually, but probably just one for now, and then see what the future holds, whether it's a GH6 or a pocket cinema camera or something like that. But the way I look at the S5 is $2,000 for what it does, bridging that gap. Like, I don't want the A7C or whatever the cheap Sony is. That's like the camera for vloggers. Another one of those. And the Canon R and the RP, I think the R is probably $2,000 right now. So if you're considering, let's look that up actually. I want to make sure. I want to see what the Canon R. I know the RP is like $1,000, which is, as far as I know, the cheapest newer full frame camera. Canon R. I hate all these new names. Like the R, it's like such a short, like a Canon R. Like R what? R1? R10? Like, give it a name. The RP, yeah, is $1,000. Where's the R? Oh, with the lens, it's like $2,000 for the Canon R. Oh, you can get it at $1,900. So for the same price as a Canon R, which came out quite a while ago, I mean, granted, if you need the autofocus, I'm sure it probably does it better than the Lumix S5. But everything else, I mean, the S5 is going to blow it out of the water. So for the price point, the S5 seems like a remarkable deal, especially if you don't have something that comes even close to it. I'd say the GH5 is in the same ballpark, right? There's a lot of reasons why the S5 is a better camera, that's for sure, but the GH5 isn't terrible in comparison. It's just a lesser version of it. In the same way the S5 is a lesser version of the S1H, and I don't know what those gaps would actually equate to if you try to do it mathematically, but in general, I think the S5 is a pretty good value for the price, and I think the A7S III is pretty good value for the price. The only limitation there being the 12 megapixel photos. If that's a deal breaker, then you're kind of out of luck. But besides that, I think the A7S III looks really, really good. So again, S5, A7S III, and then it just comes down to budget. Do you want to spend $2,000 or do you want to spend $3,500? And there's your answer. June, the EOS R looks a lot sharper than old Canon 1080p. Maybe it isn't fully downscaled sensor quality, but it has a ton more detail than the 5D Mark II. Tony Northrup streamed with it all the same, all the time, and it looks sharpish. Yeah, I'm sure the Canon R is better than the 5D Mark II. I sure hope it is at that point. But I think that is it the Canon R in 4K, you still have the severe crop that you're dealing with. And if you do want the full frame, you got to go down to 1080. Like, Canon just always seems they're so far behind, or like just oddly behind. Maybe not so far, but just oddly like behind in video features. And then the R5, they completely swung in the other direction with like these amazing, incredible features, but then like also severely limited. So really kind of like also not really quite there. And you're wondering like, what are they thinking? What are they doing? Why are they marketing this camera as doing, 8K and 4K 120 and even 4K HQ, but they're restricted, they're limited with these kind of thermal lockdowns. It doesn't make sense. I don't know what they're thinking, and it's just bizarre. I will say, I apologize. I don't know if the autofocus has been irritating. I turned it on, but I've got some settings on here. So let me know if the autofocus on this camera is really irritating. I turned it on for the first time tonight to see, because I was getting kind of frustrated with how I was having to do some stuff, it being slightly too far away where I can't quite reach it. So I was doing stuff with the app, but even then, I just wanted to see if I could get away with autofocus on the GH5. So this is autofocus, but you can tell it's not all that responsive. Wait for it. There it goes. Finally in focus. And then we're back, and we're going to sit here and wait, and we'll wait, and we'll wait, and there we go. Back in focus. Not very fast and snappy, but hey, it's something. So I'm curious to see how it looks for everyone else, if it's pulsing or irritating or annoying that the autofocus is on. Let's see. The autofocus on the S5 looks ew. Yeah, I know the Komodo isn't what you personally is hyped about, but I'd be interested in your opinion of it. How you feel it holds up to your current Ursa, if you felt global shutter really was pointless after testing. I mean, I haven't used the Komodo, so I can't speak to it personally. I think it looks like an awesome camera. I think the red price points are just a little bit uncomfortable for me in terms of like buying into that ecosystem and getting a red. And are you really getting your money's worth out of it? I think for a Komodo being 6K and it's a red camera, it's awesome. Well, you can do that with a Pocket Cinema camera 6K. Now, are they identical? No, but are they pretty close? Yeah, and the Pocket Cinema 6K is only $2,000. So you really have to evaluate who's delivering the best bang for your buck. And I think most people are going to walk away going, oh, it's a budget thing. If you have the money and the resources, there are some benefits to going with the red system. It's a newer camera. It's a mirrorless mount, so there's more flexibility there. It supposedly will have some kind of autofocus similar to the Canons. I don't know. I can't speak to that right now. I haven't seen enough testing to really know for sure one way or the other if the autofocus on the Komodo is going to be any good. But I imagine it'll be better than the Pocket Cinema camera. But if just pure image quality, dynamic range, that kind of stuff, I think they're probably so close that you really have to justify, okay, you're spending $4,000 more to get something comparable. Is that really worth it, when maybe that could go to lights, or it could go to audio equipment, it could go to lenses, it could go to any number of things? And I really think it's like looking at that, dollars for dollars, how does this all add up, and what are you actually getting for it? So I know there's people who definitely will like the Komodo because it's a red and that's cool, but for me, there's not a lot about it that makes me go like, oh, I have to have that, because so much of that, what made red special, has now become much more ubiquitous. Shooting raw, shooting high resolution, like it's kind of the standard now in a lot of ways. Like you can shoot raw on the Pocket Cinema camera 6K, you 6K raw, and I think it goes up to 60p, doesn't it? So you can technically shoot higher frame rates on the Pocket Cinema camera than you can on the Komodo. So I don't know. I don't think the Komodo's bad by any means. There's definitely some benefits to it, but also I don't know if it's worth it. It really depends on the person, how much money they have. It's because they want to tease us to make us buy their cinema cameras, which is actually a dumb way of doing it. Yes, Jayful, I agree. It's not good practice to piss off your customers, especially the people who want to buy your products. Why would you want to make them mad? They're only going to go to a different brand. They're not going to upgrade. I'm not going to buy Canon cinema cameras because I'm not happy with the Canon hybrid cameras. If I loved the if I loved the R5, maybe I would think of upgrading, to a cinema camera, because I'm just like happy customer, treat the customer right, all that stuff. No, Canon does stuff that like actively pushes people to Sony and pushes people to Lumix, which just seems, I don't know who's planning stuff over there, but I don't think they have it mapped out quite right. If the R5 had been released without 8K and 4K HQ and had great thermal management, I imagine the buzz would have been so positive. 4K 120, yeah, like, so you're talking, okay, so you're just bare bones. If it doesn't do high frame rate stuff though, I think Canon has an enthusiasm problem. So over the past 10 years, let's say, Canon has been coasting on their photographer clout, their just name recognition in the marketplace. People know Canon cameras. Oh, a Rebel, XT or whatever, a T3i, all that stuff. So they've been coasting on these kind of fumes, but they've been lacking enthusiasm from like users who, from my perspective, are like, oh, I like Canon because of the color science or the features or my lenses just work and it's great, and they're happy, but they're not the rabid enthusiast that I think you get more so with Lumix cameras and with the Sony cameras. I think those users are far more vocal about what they like and why they like it. Where Canon is more of just like people who are like, oh yeah, I'm happy, like I'm good with it. They're just content. And I think that was, encroaching and hurting them with the RP and the R. I'm sure those cameras sold well, but maybe they didn't sell quite as well as they had hoped. And so maybe for the R5 and R6, they were thinking, okay, we got to get some enthusiasm back. We got to, do the big specs, 8K, 4K 120, etc. By putting that at the forefront, though, they immediately got the attention of all those really enthusiastic, Sony and Lumix shooters. And they're like, wait a minute, what's Canon doing? Let's all eyes here. And then the overheating debacle unfolded. And all those people are the same people who were like, this is garbage. I'm not buying this camera. This sucks. Canon sucks. Yada, yada, yada. And so they go back to Sony and they go back to Lumix. Canon could have had them. They could, like those people probably would have bought it because a lot of people do like the Canon lenses. They like the Canon ergonomics. Like they like the hardware, but they just want to make sure that it delivers like on the performance side of things. And so it was really this missed opportunity where they got all the hype, they got all the enthusiasm, they had all the attention on Canon and the R5, and they botched it. I don't think you would have had that same enthusiasm if they had removed some of those features. It would have just been like, oh, another Canon camera that's, late to the party. Oh, typical Canon, doesn't even do 4K 60. Could have been the thing, right? It does 1080 60. And you're like, really? Oh, but it's full width. And people would have been like, yeah, whatever. So I think they knew they had to put some, good specs out there, the stuff that like goes on the box, that goes on the spec sheet, and that people look at and go, wow, 8K, wow, 4K 120, wow, no crop, wow. But then with the thermal lockdown, it and the timers, which is what they are clearly, it's really spoiled their party. They could have had, I don't know how many sales. I mean, pre-orders are still not being filled, so there's plenty of people who have ordered this camera that don't even have it. How many more could there have been, and how many new Canon shooters that would buy the RF lenses and they get all excited about Canon? Like, they could have had it all, and they just threw it away. The Ursa Mini Pro 4.6K is a beast. The images are up there. Yeah, J-Fold, the Ursa Mini Pro I love that camera. It's fantastic. And even the pocket cinema cameras are great for what they are. Ursa Mini Pro, couldn't be happier. It's one of my favorite, I think it is my favorite cinema camera. So I've shot with back in the day, I shot a few projects on Alexa. I shot some stuff with the Epic X, and then at some point with the Dragon 6K from Red. I've shot stuff with like the FS, was it 100, 700, like years ago now. I don't know if I've shot anything with the I think I shot one thing on the F55. I was on a project where they were using an F55, a Sony F55. But like, as far as cinema cameras go, I love the Ursa Mini Pro because it's like the perfect balance of, yeah, it's a cinema camera, but it's also an ENG camera with the built-in NDs and stuff. Like, that's becoming more and more common as well. The Canon cinema cameras, I've shot a couple projects with those, and I can't stand them. So I really like the Ursa Mini Pro, but it's got the high-end features, but in a form factor and with features that are just easy and intuitive to use. The menu system is fantastic. I've never had an issue with the camera. It just works and it's great. Yeah, I really like the Blackmagic products. I think they're fantastic. Some of the full frames, like the Sony, are as small and as light as the Micro Four Thirds, Sony A7S III, or Sony A7 III. That's why I don't like the Sony names. They're hard to read. The A7 III is lighter than a GH5. My Tamron 28, 17 to 28 is really light as well, especially compared to a Canon. Yeah, and I mean the S5 is smaller than a GH5. Like I think the sensor being bigger doesn't mean the camera body has to be bigger. It does mean the lenses have to be bigger and typically heavier, but you know, it depends by how much, I suppose. Like the Sigma 18 to 35 1.8 is a very heavy lens for what it is and the size it is. So you can definitely make smaller lenses, like the 12 to 35 2.8 for Micro Four Thirds is way smaller, way lighter than the 24 to 70 2.8 for full frame cameras. So it depends what you're after. I don't mind a slight much, but if you really need something super, super small, yeah, you probably have to go with a smaller sensor camera. Let's see. Yeah, I mentally compared all my old optical image stabilization gear with heavy L bodies. I don't know if it's just me or I'm starting to get tired of having the same camera body that teenagers get for Christmas, the T7i. I want to step it up to the cinema bodies. Well, Jayful, yeah, but even something like an S1H, and I can't imagine the teenagers are getting S5s for Christmas. They might, but like there's that in between. That's where I really like. I like the cameras that, like my Ursa Mini Pro, I don't take it on vacation. I don't take it with me, everywhere I go. I only take it for projects, that are like paid professional work. It's not just like a fun, like go around and shoot stuff, day to day with the Ursa Mini Pro. Or, hey, let's just go do a time lapse. Let me get my Ursa Mini Pro. It's like, no. Let me get my GH5. Let's go out. Let's do something fun. Let's do something creative. So that's why I like those style cameras for that type of content creation, whether it's for YouTube or whatever. The Ursa Mini Pro and the cinema body cameras, even like a Komodo. It's small, but you're going to rig it out and it's going to be bigger than something that's meant to just be handheld like a hybrid camera is, which I find really just nice and easy to use day in and day out, and then have something that you upgrade to every once in a while for the proper paid stuff. Yeah, even the RF glass, amazing quality, but chunky. Same for the Lumix S-series bodies. Nikon Z isn't so bad. And the before times I traveled quite a bit and really liked the A7 III size. I think a lot of the Sony cameras I've used before, and I haven't used the A7 III, so I can't speak to it, but I know the A7S II, I'm pretty sure, like felt really small. Maybe it was the original A7S. One of those two. Like the Sony cameras have gotten bigger over time. I like it to like fit solidly in my hand. It doesn't feel like it's going to just like fall out like this little toy. That's why I never really liked the NEX cameras, the Sony NEX, the APS-C ones they have. They just feel so cheap and tiny. Sony cameras to me feel like really nice TV remotes. I don't know why, but it just feels like a TV remote. Like the way the menus work, the way the buttons work, it feels like a TV remote that can take pictures, where every other camera feels more like a camera first. For some reason, the Sony ones just feel odd to me. The box body, the camcorder body. Why you can't stand the Canon cinema cameras? The ones I shot with in the past, the MXF file structure was really annoying and irritating to work with. And for me, that's a lot of it. Using a camera on set, usually you can, have workarounds, deal with stuff. Okay, you get everything set, you hit record, great, you're done. And then you go to process it. And if the file structure or the system folders are just a nightmare with stuff split up in all these different folders, and like the Sony systems have been like that for a while. I don't know if they're still that way. I like opening up an SD card or a card from the camera, and it's just like, here's a folder, here's all your files. That's what the Ursa Mini Pro does. That's what the GH5 does. That's what the R5 does as well. It's just a folder with all your stuff. And when you open up anything, if you open up some of the Sony stuff in the past that I've worked with, or some of the Canon cinema stuff, and you have like 6 folders, and you're like, okay, which one of these do I need to go into? And then you even try and play them back, and they're these MXF files, and they don't play right, and you need to install this other nonsense. I hate that stuff. I think it's really annoying and a burden to work with, and have just never had good luck. So I'm sure Canon has maybe changed that over the years. So this was quite a while ago on the original like it's the C300 or the C500. I forget which one. But I find that stuff really irritating. It just rubs me the wrong way. Like, it doesn't make the process fun. I think content creation should be fun and should be free of any of the like the hair pulling or annoyances. You know, I just want it to work and work well so I can focus on being creative and producing content, not troubleshooting and bug fixes and workarounds. That is like the death of creativity and productivity. I think the box body looks way more updated for cinema cameras, although the camcorder body is nice too, like the Ursas and the Aries. I'm trying to think, how do I shoot? The Ursa, I shoot both ways. I shoot kind of like boxy, you know, like down at the hip style, but then there's other times where I put up on the shoulder. It really depends on the lens that I'm using and the type of content I'm filming. So more so on the lens. Longer focal lengths typically will, you know, be up higher, up on the shoulders, more comfortable to balance a longer lens. Or if it's something wider, you know, the 18 to 35, let's say, put that in the Ursa Mini, handheld down at the hip, you know, box style, however you want to film. I think the Ursa Mini Pro is plenty boxy. It's a little bigger, you know, it's certainly bigger than the Komodo, but you don't have to rig it out with the whole shoulder pad style. You can do it basically as a box too if you wanted. Let's see, where am I at? I'm going to wrap this up soon. Yeah, the ergonomics maybe not quite as good as others, but the size I quite enjoy. The A7 III is basically the same size as the A7, A7 II, slightly larger grip. Okay. I just got to feel it in my hand and know if it's the right size or not. The R5 is the right size. Canon should keep that size. I like it. Thumbs up for me. Because I'm debating on getting the C200 or the C300 if possible, the Mark II. The C200 came out, what, a couple years ago? I think there's a lot of people that really like the C200. I think maybe the C70 is going to be the new one from Canon. The C70, maybe kind of like the new go-to for that lower end of the market. Maybe a replacement for the C200 and even a smaller body. We'll see. But yeah, the C70 from Canon should be the next one that people will be excited for. The Komodo box looks so friggin' amazing. Oh, the Komodo box looks so friggin' amazing. Some Z cams doesn't look too bad though. Never seen any one of them in real life. Red big camera is a tad too big for me, I think. Didn't seem practical at all in real life. Looks a weird autocorrect type of. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, red cameras just look cool because they've spent a lot of time in refining, making a cool looking camera. At the end of the day, if you just want to take pictures of yourself and put them on Instagram or do like behind the scenes videos and have a cool looking camera, that's one thing. But if, you know, to me, it's more about like the footage and the end result. And if the camera looks a bit wonky or it's not quite as cool because it's from Blackmagic or it's from Lumix or it's from Sony, so what? The only people who care are the other, you know, camera addicts. It shouldn't be what you're thinking about with the content. I do think the red cameras look cool because they've done a good job marketing their cameras as such. So don't get me wrong. Like, if someone has a red, like, oh, that looks cool. Because they do. They make nice looking products. But at what price are you willing to pay for a camera that looks cool versus, hey, I might buy something a little bit cheaper, more reasonable, and invest in a whole kit of stuff rather than just buying the Komodo because it's going to look cool, but then you're not going to be able to shoot anything because you don't have lights, you don't have audio or whatever. Granted, if, you know, someone's thinking about getting a Komodo, they probably already have all that other stuff anyway, but there definitely are people who think that maybe they're on the younger side, you know, maybe I thought this way at one point in time too, but oh, just get a red and like that'll make you professional and then your footage will look amazing. And it's like, no, you can film stuff that looks awful with a red. Just like you film any camera can look bad and it can look good. It's almost always about the lighting. So I always try and put that first rather than worrying too much about the camera and how cool it looks and how much it costs and what brand it's from. It's just like, does it take good footage? Is it fun and easy, intuitive to use? Okay, great. No, like, let's get to work making content. So no one answered if the autofocus was annoying or not, or if it looked good. If it's fine and if it's acceptable, I'll just leave it as is, and it makes it a little bit easier so I don't have to check focus every time I do a stream. But if it's obnoxious, I'll turn it off. But I'll wrap it up there. Jafel says facts, and I'm losing my voice, actually. I need to get a drink of water. I don't have one with me. So I'll call it a night there. Have a good night or a good morning, wherever you're at, and we'll talk later.